Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. My name is Jeremy Nettles. I am the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana. If you would like to join us for our Sunday worship, then head on over to 5600 Van Road in Newburgh. We begin at 10, although we also have a Bible study that begins at 9 a.m. before that. We meet again on Sunday afternoons at 4 p.m. if an afternoon worship is a little bit more convenient for you, and we would welcome you for any and all of those times. You can also find a Bible study at that same location at 7 p.m. on Wednesdays, and you're welcome to join that as well. If you would like to share a comment or a question or a request for a future topic of study on either this program or any of our other outreach methods, then feel free to get in touch over the phone at 812-550-6234 or by email at info@riverridgechurch.org. Man who is born of a woman is few of days and full of trouble. He comes out like a flower and withers. He flees like a shadow and continues not. And do you open your eyes on such a one and bring me into judgment with you? Who can bring a clean thing out of it unclean? There is not one. Since his days are determined and the number of his months is with you, and you have appointed his limits that he cannot pass, look away from him and leave him alone that he may enjoy, like a hired hand, his day. For there is hope for a tree, if it be cut down, that it will sprout again, and that its shoots will not cease. Though its root grow old in the earth and its stump die in the soil, yet at the scent of water it will bud and put out branches like a young plant. But a man dies and is laid low. Man breathes his last. And where is he? This passage in Job 14 has become well-loved and somewhat iconic for a reason, at least verse 1. That language, man who is born of a woman is few of days and full of trouble, it captures very well the daily struggle that we all experience just to get through life, more or less in one piece. Our lives are comparatively short. When you are young, you look forward at all the years that you expect to have ahead of you, and you think, I have not yet begun to live. I have 5 young boys. Their ages are 7, 5, 3, 2, and 6 months. And people that we meet in the grocery store who are in their 60s, 70s, maybe 80s, say over and over and over to my wife and me, enjoy it while you can. Before you know it, they'll be out of the house. These are people looking back on their lives with their kids and wishing that it hadn't gone so quickly. Even though they have been around for the better part of a century, they still feel as if their lives have been comparatively short. And they're not ready, by and large, for it to be over. But eventually it will be over. Eventually death is coming for us all. And at least in this world, there is a sense of finality about death. Now, if you're a believer, then you know that we have a promise of something beyond, something far greater than what we have to put up with here. But we can't directly observe it yet, can we? We have the promises, we may trust those promises, but we haven't seen it with our own eyes. And so, as far as the physical world is concerned, death seems to be not only the great equalizer, but it seems to be absolutely final. Job, in his long speech here in chapter 14, is complaining about this situation. Our lives are short, and death comes to us all. But on top of that, the lives that we lead, well, as Job said in verse 1, they're full of trouble. Life is hard. Think about the current situation in the world today. We've all been putting up with this pandemic for what seems like an eternity, although it's only been a year and a half. COVID has been taxing, and just when it seemed like the case numbers were decreasing at a rate such that we could pretty much get back to life as normal, then we have this new variant and this astonishing resurgence. We spent a year and a half sacrificing and tolerating impositions on ourselves, on our freedom, on our way of life, also tolerating each other's opinions when we didn't agree. We've gone through a lot of uncertainty. We have dealt with perhaps a lot of fear. At least in my circles, the people with whom I spend the most of my time, there's a general consensus that we were just ready to be done with it all. And then Delta shows up. And here we go again. It's not even just the health ramifications. As far as Delta is concerned, the death numbers have been far, far lower than the initial strain that made its way into our part of the world. But as I said, it's not just the health concerns. Our method of dealing with the pandemic has had striking ramifications on the economy. It was basically dragged to a halt. Now, sure, at least in our country, the government has been artificially keeping the economy more or less afloat, but it hasn't exactly been pursuing that course of action with a great deal of concern for the guardrails. And there's increasingly the feeling that it's not exactly sustainable, is it? And even with all those measures, even with all that the governments have been trying to do to prop things up, look around. I'm sure you have noticed that the gas prices are up. You've probably noticed that food prices are up. You've probably noticed that home prices are way up. It's not even just that. It's not just COVID. It's not just the health ramifications. It's not just the economic ramifications. Even before COVID, we had plenty of issues. We have relationship issues with our friends, with our family. Sometimes we have people in our lives that simply make life difficult. People whom we love, who make it hard to love them. And when dealing with perhaps something like COVID, when dealing with all the other struggles that you and I and everyone has in their life, then you come home to a place that you expect to be safe from all those sorts of trouble. And perhaps there's someone there who makes life difficult again. And perhaps you're left feeling that nothing is truly safe. I am constantly hearing of spouses having trouble with each other. I'm constantly hearing of marriages breaking up, or at the very least facing substantial trial, substantial challenge. Sometimes it's not even because of a personal conflict exactly, but because of another one of the great hardships of life, finances. Maybe your financial troubles could be related to the pandemic, as we have discussed, but realistically, before COVID ever was a thing, there was plenty of financial strife, financial struggle. We go through life with expectations and assumptions, and many of the expectations are disappointed. Many of our assumptions turn out to be false. Seems like everything costs, and increasingly costs more and more, and there rarely seems to be enough at the end of the month for what we need. Maybe you have even worse problems, major health problems. Everybody's going to face that eventually if they live long enough. Age brings on ailments and diseases that eventually kill. It's not always directly related to age. How many people do you know or have you known who have died of cancer? How many people have you known who died far too young from cancer? There are some people on that list for me. What about things like heart disease and diabetes and the seemingly ever-expanding list of autoimmune diseases and disorders that we keep discovering anew? Health is a major trouble. Maybe your troubles, maybe you've been blessed in all of those areas. Maybe you don't have to deal a whole lot with financial issues or with relationship struggles or with health problems. Maybe your troubles are more humdrum. Maybe it's just the constant, unending pain and frustration of nasty people at work. Either your coworkers or perhaps your clientele who seem to revel in making your life as difficult as they can. Oftentimes I notice that these are people who are themselves miserable, and what they're really trying to do is not just to make you miserable, but they're just trying to spread that hurt around to as many people as they can. Because they think, if I'm suffering, then I'm going to make you suffer too. Jesus has gone through some of that. Jesus understands our suffering. And he left us, both through his own words and through the words of his apostles, much encouragement about how to deal with our struggles. For example, in beginning what we call the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5 through 7, he says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account." So Jesus is here telling us that suffering is a part of being in the kingdom of heaven. If you want to be a part of his kingdom, if you want to be in the family, so to speak, then you're going to have to put up with this sort of thing. You're going to have others reviling you and saying all sorts of evil against you for Jesus' sake. You're going to have to put up with some hunger and some thirst. You're going to be poor in spirit. You're going to have to do some mourning. When we get to chapter 6, he says in verse 34, "Therefore do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble." He's giving us this encouragement to not be anxious, which first of all highlights that we need to be told that because we are predisposed to anxiety. Second of all, he says, sufficient for the day is its own trouble. It's not only that he's saying, don't worry because your Father is going to take care of you. He is saying that in the previous couple of verses especially, he makes that very clear. But he's also saying, don't worry so much about tomorrow because there's plenty of evil today for you to concern yourself with. Jesus understands our troubles. As I said, Jesus is not the only one to say these sorts of things. He said more of them, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to leave it at those couple. But if we look farther, decades into the future, after he said those things, when he had sent his apostles out to spread the gospel to the entire world, we find, for example, Peter saying in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 19, "For this is a gracious thing when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly." Once again, Peter is extolling the virtue of suffering, and he's saying that God expects us to endure it with grace, even if it is unjust suffering. And he gives us some reassurance that God understands our suffering, that he sees our pain, and that he desires for us to endure as Jesus himself endured. If we back up, we can see what the author of Hebrews had to say in chapter 10, verses 32 and 33. "But recall the former days when, after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, sometimes being partners with those so treated." That's difficult. That's very frustrating. It's painful. It is, well, as the author of Hebrews here calls it, suffering. To be publicly ridiculed, especially because of your faith in Christ. It's a struggle. We suffer. We could keep listing passages like these for hours. But I hope it's clear from what we have seen so far, not only does Jesus know that we struggle, but he expects us to put up with it. He expects us to endure. Life is a constant struggle. It's full of trouble. So tell that to all those people in Afghanistan, right? Maybe that puts things into perspective for you a little. Think about the predicament of all of the people who are stuck there now. They have to put up with a new boss who is quite different from the old boss. The new boss, the Taliban, is not particularly interested in the well-being of the general populace of that country now. We've seen over the last few weeks an intense struggle to get out of that country. This is a country of millions of people, and how many thousands of them feel as if there is a giant target on their back with the new rulers? How many people were willing to risk their lives in order to potentially save their lives? We've all seen the pictures of crowds in Kabul struggling to get into this locked down airport in the city. We've seen video of these crowds of people trying to climb on to moving airplanes. And it's easy for us to see those things and to scoff at these nincompoops. Are you stupid? How do you think this is gonna work? Do you really think you're gonna manage to hold on to this thing while it flies at 12,000 feet? But they're not stupid. These people knew what they were risking. They know that the airplane is closed. They know very well what likely awaits them if they manage to hang on. Here's an image you've probably seen, an example of someone who did manage to hang on. And then the plane managed to hang on to him. That is his lifeless body, hung up in the landing gear of that plane. And that's for the ones who managed to hang on. Most of them didn't. I'm sure that you've seen this by now as well. Those two dots are two human beings falling from the plane to their deaths. You've probably seen this video as well. Look how far a parent is willing to go in order to save his child from the Taliban. Handing this baby off to American servicemen who are leaning over the razor wire on top of the wall in order to rescue this child. He would rather his child grow up in a stranger's home. And he trusts that at least if he passes the child on to the Americans, they will treat the child better than the Taliban would. There are thousands of people who still would like to get out. And then, of course, you all remember the Thursday before last, there was a suicide bombing outside the airport. At the time of this recording, the death toll had reached about 200, including 13 U.S. service members. The next day, do you know what that location looked like? Pretty much the same. The same people were crowding into the same spot, knowing that there could very well be another suicide bombing that day. But they considered it to be worth the risk in order to get out. I usually take any sort of sensational reports with a healthy dose of salt, but I've been seeing increasing reports of Christians being targeted, being tracked down and murdered in Afghanistan for their faith. Reports of, for example, members of the Taliban going from door to door and checking people out, not only to root out known Christians, but also checking over their smartphones and seeing whether they have any Bible apps or other insidious contraband like that. That would be incriminating. And so Christians were fleeing for the hills. And from what I hear, some of them, a lot of them, being rescued by Good Samaritans is the best term I can come up with. This is far from the first time that Christians have had to put up with this sort of treatment. In Matthew chapter 24, Jesus is predicting what's going to happen in the lead up to the fall of Jerusalem. And he says, beginning in verse 9, "Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fade away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved." So that's what Jesus predicted. In the early days of the church, we find James talking about some persecution as well. In James chapter 2, in the midst of talking about partiality and how we ought to avoid that, James says in verse 6, "Are not the rich the ones who oppress you and the ones who drag you into court? Are they not the ones who blaspheme the honorable name by which you were called?" They were seeing persecution by the rich and being dragged before the courts already. Some of them were being executed. In Acts chapter 12, we can see an example of this persecution. About this time, Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James the brother of John with the sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. It's obvious that Herod wants to subject Peter to exactly the same treatment that had befallen James, not the one that wrote the letter, but James, the brother of John. Well, Peter was rescued that particular time, but it wasn't to happen that way forever. In fact, Jesus predicted in John chapter 21 that eventually Peter would be executed for his faith. There in verse 18, we read, "Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go." He's predicting that Peter will be crucified. And as far as we can tell, based on the traditions, that's exactly what happened. When we consider the treatment that Christians have experienced throughout history, as well as the situation of even non-Christians in a place like Afghanistan today and for the last few weeks, in truth, we have it pretty good, don't we? The truth is that we make most of our own problems. Going back to James in chapter 4, he tells us this pretty clearly. Verse 1, "What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you?" We are the reason. We are the source of so many of our problems. Think about the marriage troubles that I mentioned before. So often, those are tied to past sins of one party or the other, and most often, both. On top of that, we could consider this current craze of gender confusion. Just in the past week, I have heard of 2 separate instances of children in ostensibly Christian homes. One of these I've met, and one is a friend of a friend. And in both of these cases, these children have suddenly declared themselves to be the opposite sex. And the parents, who know better, in both cases have gone along with it. We as a society, we as a nation, we as individuals bring so many problems on ourselves. Here's one: abortion. Approximately 90% of abortions are performed on unmarried women and their children. Now, call it old-fashioned, prudish, stodgy, or I don't know, there's probably a much more colorful term that abortion advocates would prefer to use here, but this is a family program. Anyhow, our society used to know that the prerequisite for becoming pregnant had its own prerequisite, namely marriage. That wasn't just a kooky idea dreamed up by Puritans who didn't want anyone to have any fun. It's the baseline assumption in practically every civilization ever. We're the weirdos here for being so absurdly permissive about nearly everything sexual. And I say nearly with some hesitancy because of the direction that things are headed. Sex outside of the context of marriage, as God defined marriage, is classified throughout the Bible as fornication, as sin. So, in dealing with the uncomfortable consequences of one sin, we, in a manner of speaking, seek to atone for that sin by killing the child who did nothing to deserve such treatment. This is a problem of our own making, isn't it? Very often, not always, but very often, our health problems even, and our financial struggles, and our quarrels with one another are the results of our own sin. Now, they're still real problems. They still require real solutions. But most of them, when you get down to it, were created by us. And many of them were created by us because we don't have anything worse to combat. All those people in Afghanistan, I noticed that almost none of them are wearing masks. I noticed that they don't particularly care about social distancing. I noticed that even the COVID hawks in the media and the government aren't stumping on the fact of their callous, reckless behavior, congregating like that in the middle of a pandemic. That's because they have real problems. While we're at it, those same people don't seem to have a lot of abortion or gender confusion or that kind of thing either. We don't have very many real problems, so we have to make up our own. They don't have that privilege. The truth is that by and large we are rather sheltered and rather privileged. Occasionally, a problem arises that we couldn't or shouldn't have reasonably foreseen or averted, but 90% or more of our troubles are the direct result of our own actions. Sometimes those are just foolish choices, things that maybe we should have known better, but it's not really a moral issue. Often, it is a moral issue. Often, our troubles are because of our sin. So let's put things into perspective instead of just feeling sorry for ourselves for all of our many, many struggles and problems. Remember that Jesus came to forgive us for the sins that we've committed, even those that lead to all those problems. He also came to purify us. Remember the message that he preached? We can find it in Matthew chapter 4, verse 17. He said, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." That's how we could summarize the entire gospel. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. That's the good news. Great, wonderful. Everything is going to be better in the kingdom of heaven. But you need to be ready for it. You need to repent. And the kingdom is basically here, folks. We are awaiting its completion in the most final sense at the end of all things. But the kingdom is in the world today. It is the church. And if you want to be a part of his kingdom, then you need to be purified. If you have already been cleansed, if you have already been purified, then don't turn back. Because it's very easy for someone who has been purified to then go back and introduce further impurities. Peter tells us this in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 22. What the true proverb says has happened to them. The dog returns to its own vomit, and the sow, after washing herself, returns to wallow in the mire. While you're at it, it's worth reading the few verses before that, but the idea here is that having once allowed Jesus to rule over your life, it's not very good to go back and eat your own vomit. Having been cleaned of the disgusting filth of the mud pit, it's not good to dive right back in and cover yourself with your own excrement again. Allow Jesus to actually be in charge of your life. If you try to accept his forgiveness, but won't submit to his authority, well, then the gift of forgiveness is no longer really offered to you. If you need help submitting to his authority, if you need to be washed of your sins and reborn as a new person, holy and acceptable in God's presence, then please get in touch with us at River Ridge. You can reach us at 812-550-6234 or info@riverridgechurch.org, or you can find us on Facebook or YouTube to find out more. Please ask us your questions or sign up for a study with me or another of our members. You can also join us at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh at 9 a.m. Sunday for Bible study and then 10 a.m. for worship. We also gather at 4 p.m. on Sundays and at 7 p.m. on Wednesdays for another study. I hope to see you there. Thank you for joining me today on Iron Sharpens Iron.